Welcome to the Who, What, Why podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Schechtman. Paul Krassner was an icon of the 60s, but his words and his cultural influence carried right up until his death this week at the age of 87. He was a violin prodigy as a child and then a success as a stand-up comic. He liked to call himself an investigative satirist, and People magazine called him the father of the underground press. He founded the Realist magazine back in 1958 and published it through 2001. For many years, his style of personal journalism blurred the line between observer and participant. He covered the anti-war movement and co-founded the Yippies with Abbie Hoffman and Jerry Rubin. He published material on the psychedelic revolution and then dropped acid with Timothy Leary, Ram Dass, and Ken Kesey. As a stand-up comic, he was mentored by Lenny Bruce, and then he edited Lenny Bruce's autobiography. He hosted his own radio call-in show in San Francisco and was the head writer for an HBO special satirizing a presidential election campaign. Mercury Records released his first two comedy albums, We Have Ways of Making You Laugh and Brain Damage Control, and his articles have appeared in numerous publications, including Rolling Stone, Playboy, Mother Jones, and The Nation. His autobiography was titled Confessions of an Unconfined Nut, Misadventures in the Counterculture, but George Carlin really has the final word on Krassner. Carlin said, "This man is dangerous and funny and necessary." Back in July of 2009, exactly 10 years ago, I had the opportunity to record an extended conversation with Krassner, and the following 30 minutes are part of that conversation. The title, Paul, of your newest book is Who's to Say What's Obscene? Politics, Culture, and Comedy in America Today. As we look at obscenity in politics and comedy in America today, hypocrisy really is the new obscenity in some ways.
Oh, yeah. The most recent example of it is are these people in governors and senators who have these affairs, and yet they're the same ones who have campaigned against same-sex marriage, against adultery. People like Gary Condit, who was a leader in the fight to get Bill Clinton impeached. He himself later on had an affair with an intern, Chandra Levy. Somebody asked William Bennett, the morality czar, what if that wasn't hypocritical. And Bennett said, well, hypocrisy is better than having no values at all. And that became my mantra.
Talk a little bit about comedy today. You know, we have a whole bunch of young people today that get their news from Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert, and the link between news and reality and satire seems to be closer than it ever was since the 60s.
Yeah, well, you know, it used to be what Steve Allen said, that comedy is tragedy plus time. But then, you know, there's been an acceleration of everything, including the rate of acceleration is accelerating. And so there became less of a space between a tragedy and a comedy until they were happening simultaneously. And, for example, Jay Leno told a joke about the Waco Davidian cult that was there while it was burning.
Right.
And it was still in the process of burning, and the joke was that there are two kinds of members of the cult there now, regular and crispy. So it's a cute joke, but it was just strange to hear it while the fire was in progress. Now, so that was simultaneously. Now, there were jokes about Michael Jackson even before he was buried. So it's now sort of that tragedy is comedy plus time.
How much of that is because we have trouble getting our heads around anything, getting to understand anything in this 24/7 news cycle, accelerated culture you're talking about, that the only way we can come to grips with it sometimes is through comedy?
That's part of it, but part of it is the need for topicality. And so writers for comedy shows, I was the head writer once for an HBO satire of the election in 1980. And writers would come to me and say, I can't find the funny in this, you know, and so there's a kind of desensitivization that goes on, where comedy writers have to find something because it's in the news, even though it hasn't been digested yet. It hasn't been the implications of the news haven't been savored yet. They just and a lot of them aren't really making any points, and that sarcasm passes for irony,
right?
And easy reference jokes, So Ted Kennedy used to be the reference for a fat joke, but then he got brain cancer and a tumor, and he stopped being a joke, and they would put somebody else in. It's just and audiences, they don't always laugh; they just applaud, and it's as if they're really applauding themselves because they recognize the reference.
The only exception to that, it's interesting, perhaps the only exception to that idea of topicality of comedy was 9/11. It took a long time before anyone dared joke about that.
Yeah, everybody. In fact, Larry King was asking comedians. He said to Bill Maher, "Is it time yet? When can you do a joke about him? When about 9/11? It's too soon." And because the whole country was wounded. But now I did a show a week ago, and I asked, "Is it too soon to do anything about Michael Jackson?" And the whole audience said, "No, it's not too soon." So, I think we're all getting jaded.
You started The Realist back in 1958 because you said at the time that there were no other publications that really engaged in adult humor. Talk about what was going on back then, why you thought that was important.
Yeah, I started it at the end of the 50s, which was known as the silent generation. There was... I think the counterculture exploded out of the blandness and repression of the Eisenhower-Nixon years. Just as now there seems to be a evolutionary jump in consciousness happening, exploding out of the repression and blandness of the Bush-Cheney years. It's a different timing now. I mean, there are comedians who say, "Oh, I miss George Bush," but I was happy to sacrifice him.
But yet, even without Bush there's still a lot to make fun of.
Oh, sure, yeah. It doesn't, people say, "Well, Obama's so nice, we can't make fun of him." But, there are issues. There are other areas. There's always, as long as there's controversy, as long as there are contradictions, between what people say and what they do, it's a natural to be made fun of. But what happens is a lot of the comedians want to get their 6 minutes on the David Letterman show, Jay Leno when he was on, and now Conan O'Brien. They make fun of personalities rather than issues.
Talk about the humor of Lenny Bruce, and he was your mentor in terms of the stand-up comedy you did, and what that comedy was about, because it really was about issues and irony.
Oh, yeah. That's the thing, that people associate Lenny with rough language, when actually he was the first comedian I know to make fun of the of nuclear testing, to poke fun at the irrationality of the drug laws, what I call the war on some people who use some drugs. He talked about the low teacher salaries. There were really issues that people now don't associate with him, but he broke through the traditional kind of borscht comedians who did mother-in-law jokes, who did Asian driver jokes.
Catholic Church?
Yes. Lenny got deeper into it, and would use lines like, "People are leaving the church and going back to God." And so he represented that cultural shift that was going on, where people were trying to get away from Western religions of control and in their spiritual path turned to Eastern disciplines. And so there's and interestingly enough, Barack Obama is the first president who actually, in his inauguration speech, acknowledged the existence of non-believers.
Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit about when the comedy of that period and the irony of that period in the late 50s into the mid 60s, into 66, 67, started to give way to an anger that was very different than the comedy that preceded it?
There was a time when I think it started in England where it was called the generation of angry young men. I think it was imitation of style. So, for example, if people wanted to get on David Letterman's show, they tried to mimic him, and what they did was kind of adopt his style of cynicism, and that was their role model. You know, they don't. The same thing with Conan O'Brien, you know, and David Letterman don't like political stuff that much, and so the comedians would do jokes about their first date, or if they got married, then about the problems in being married. But it was relatively superficial. It wasn't really getting at the heart of things, and they were hostile. I know that a woman came up to me after the end of one of my shows, and she said, "Thank you, I was so afraid to come." I said, "Afraid? Why?" She said, "Well, I've been to a comedy show before, and they made me cry." She was sitting in the front row, and they used her as a target. And I said, No, I just want to make you laugh, that's all. So it became a style, and like almost any industry, people would simply imitate the successes, and the successes were based on the lowest common denominator.
And when did the anger set in, though, in that period in the 60s? When did the comedy give way to anger?
That's a hard question. I think the Vietnam War had something to do with the anger, because there was frustration, and there was a draft at the time, and there were people wearing lapel buttons that said, "Not with my body, you don't." And because of the draft, people could relate to it. It wasn't an abstract thing. Everybody knew somebody who was going to be drafted, and it affected their families and their friends and their co-workers. And I think the war had a lot to do with it, because more and more people realized that it was a war that was unjustified, and that was really an invasion of another country. And they used the communist domino theory as a rationale. And just like the war in Iraq, it was based on lies, it was based on euphemisms. Then they would refer to concentration camps as strategic Hamlets, and now they refer to torture as enhanced interrogation techniques. So, it's just continuing to pull new wool over new eyes.
You have referred to yourself as a kind of investigative satirist. Talk about that and the investigative part of it, the work that you've done with The Realist and in other publications, and how you've turned that investigative ability to satire and to humor.
Yeah, well, as a journalist and as a satirist, I could see relationships between the two. Sometimes you just report the news and people laugh because they haven't read that yet, and they think you're making up something brilliant. When such as there are actually spray-on condoms now. But if you tell people that they don't know about it, they think, "Wow, what an interesting concept. That's very funny." It's just in my case, I do a lot of research out of which to draw up material that calls to be targeted as satire, and it's just the more information I can get, the wider my awareness of the hypocrisy or the contradictions in it that can be made fun of. So it's dealing with the information, not just the stereotypes of Bob Dole was the old guy.
Right.
So if you want to have old guy jokes, Bob Dole was the image you used. But they didn't talk about his policy so much, just their ageist jokes.
Some of the most controversial investigative stuff that you've done had to do with the Kennedy assassination, going back to the expose about Mae Brussel in 1972. Talk a little about that, Paul.
when it was a turning point in American history when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, and I reported. I published articles by Mae Russell, who was the queen of conspiracy research. This was before computers, and so she had like 40 filing cabinets filled with folders of under various categories. And so when the Watergate break-in occurred in June of 1972, it brought together the 8 years of research she had done, and she saw connections, the same names popping up, the modus operandi, and she made those connections in terms of the secret government. And for me, I could get humor out of it, such as the example that comes to mind is that there were bullet holes in his throat, theoretically from the book depository where Lee Harvey Oswald was, but also from the grassy knoll where the three conspirators who were dressed as tramps were. And so I was able to make a joke about that Kennedy had been a satanic figure, and it was like in The Exorcist. His head turned around 180 degrees at the precise moment that the shooting was taking place, which is why it looked like the bullet came from the book depository. So, so I had to research the stuff about autopsies and conspiracy theories before I could, come to that satirical conclusion.
Talk about the impact that Kennedy's assassination had on you at the time.
Well, he was the first president that I voted for, and when it happened, you knew that it was done for a purpose. It was like a military coup, in a sense. And Mort Saul, for example, left the comedy world temporarily and went down to New Orleans to assist in the DA Jim Garrison's investigation of the assassination. And it's interesting that a lot of the comedians that I've known and associated with have been conspiracy theorists, because for comedy, you have to kind of step outside of the regular boundaries to see what can be humorous about it. And so Lenny Bruce, Mort Saul, Orson Bean, Barry Crimmins, Richard Belzer, who even wrote a book about conspiracy theories. So it's interesting to me that there should be that connection, but it makes sense, because for conspiracy theories, you also have to kind of think out of that proverbial box.
Talk about Lenny Bruce and how he dealt with the Kennedy assassination.
When Kennedy died, Lenny made a remark that when Jackie Kennedy got on to the back of the car, Lenny said, "Oh, she was hauling ass." Actually, though, she was trying to retrieve a piece of Kennedy's brain that flew out onto the back of the car. But he talked about, he took a biological approach to politics, and would talk about how, the horniness of a womanizer like Kennedy, and how he would tell the Secret Service agents, "Okay, stop there. I want to go have a tryst in the woods with Marilyn," or something. It was just he just took the humanness and the foibles of these political icons and made fun of them in a way that people who were not in power could understand, and could see that, as Henry Kissinger once said, that power is the ultimate aphrodisiac.
When Lenny Bruce died in '66, talk about your sense of that at the time.
Oh, well, on one level, I thought it was very sad, because as a satirist, he had so much more to offer, and he was so uncompromising in his work. And as a personal friend, it was a great loss, too. My current obsession is working on a novel about a contemporary type Lenny, which stemmed from 1966. After he died, I kept thinking, what would Lenny be saying now? What would be his take on this? And there has come a certain point now where I thought that I was actually channeling Lenny. And until one day he said to me, "Come on, you don't believe in that crap." So I stopped channeling him.
Talk about how your audiences, and you still do stand up from time to time. How have your audiences changed? Who comes today? What do you see today?
The most gratifying thing is that old fans of my work come with their offspring, or offspring bring their parents. That it shatters the myth of the generation gap. And I did a show last week, and people came up and said it's different from the humor they see on TV, except for people like I guess the big three is Jon Stewart, Stephen Colbert, and Bill Maher. But they appreciate it. There's a hunger for it because these are really depressing times and repressing times. And the more repression there is, the more need there is for irreverence towards those in authority who are responsible for that repression.
Do you think there's anything that you could call a counterculture out there today?
Sure. There's always been a counterculture. I mean, in recent decades, it went from the bohemians to the beats to the hippies to the yippies to the punks to the hip-hop. So there's always a counterculture, and it just has taken different forms. And so I think now it's become much more a multi-ethnic, multi-racial kind of process. And especially with the help of the Internet, one of the reasons I stopped The Realist was because I wanted to eventually put myself out of business in the sense that I acted as the canary in the coal mine of taking chances and living out what the First Amendment is just a law. I mean, free speech existed before the First Amendment, and people mistake it now. If there's censorship, they say, "Oh, that's a violation of the First Amendment," which is not accurate because the First Amendment only applies to when the government is involved in suppressing speech. And so I think what used to be called the counterculture now has become mainstream culture in terms of anybody can do what I was doing on the Internet, in the sense that my goal was to communicate without compromise. And the web provides that forum. Anybody can communicate without compromise. And there's a law of supply and demand in terms of the audience for their communication, and there's a lot of competition for it. But so I think that all of the things that the '60s counterculture, the seeds that they planted, are still blossoming. Whether it's organic food or environmental concern, or they were a threat to the economy in terms of they didn't buy insurance policies. They lived in communes and took care of each other. They would pool their money and have one car for several people. They would make their own clothes. They would make candles and use them instead of light bulbs. So it was a threat to the economy, and the think tank certainly found that out.
It's interesting. You look back at the 60s and your founding of the Yippies and the anti-Vietnam protests and everything else, that it all involved a certain degree of organization and a certain organizational skill that something like the Internet and Twitter makes so much easier today.
It's changed the nature of the Internet. Has changed the nature of protest itself. We used to have to get our hands messy with mimeograph ink, getting leaflets ready, which would then be mailed to people or delivered at rallies. And now MoveOn.org organized demonstrations. So much easier. It was quicker. It was immediate. It was a wider audience that was reached, and it was just almost simultaneous that kind of organizing could be done, and it didn't cost the money for stamps, and it's a whole different process now that's going on. People, and it applies to other areas too. Medicine, people can communicate with people who have had the same medical symptoms with others, and not just depend on doctors. So there is a process of some kind of citizens' revolt that's going on, and it's a very subversive phenomenon that's being done out in the open. I like that combination.
But is it too diffuse? Is it ever going to reach any kind of critical mass as kind of the 60s protest did around Vietnam and civil rights?
Well, those civil rights and the Vietnam War were, and a few other things, decriminalization of marijuana and abortion rights. These were some of the main issues of during the 60s. Now there are, I counted at least 25 different causes that are going on, which does kind of, and some of them are. In fact, the slogan, the song of the 60s was "We shall overcome," and now it's become, in effect, "We shall overlap." Because there are so many causes, save the whales, save the rainforests, wages for housewives. There are so many causes, and they're all, most of them are justified. Some of them are trivial, but everybody has their own agenda and perceives reality through that agenda.
And does that make it more difficult for any of those agendas to really be achieved and for there to be, as I said, critical mass around any of them today?
I think so. It's the ones that I think it has to do with numbers. When I needed surgery in about 20 years ago, there were 37 million, including myself, who did not have health insurance. And now there are 47 million. So that's why healthcare and the economy, jobs, are the two big issues, because that's what most people are suffering from.
How about the discussion with respect to drugs today? Certainly that was a big part of the 60s and not as much a part of our discussion today.
Yeah, I think it's reached a level of a tipping point in public awareness of the hypocrisy behind the laws. My feeling is that as long as any government can decide which drugs are legal and which are not legal, then anybody in prison on a drug offense is really a political prisoner. And, so that 1,300 people a day die in this country alone from cigarette smoking, and yet marijuana causes no deaths. The worst that'll happen is maybe somebody will raid the refrigerator at midnight for the munchies. So there is now more and more talk of making marijuana legal so that it can then be taxed, which would help, especially in California, billions of dollars in taxes that could be raised. And so I think that, it's kind of doing the right thing for the wrong reason. I think that marijuana should be decriminalized so that people shouldn't spend time behind bars because they were smoking a weed, and not because it's going to bring more money to the local economy.
When you talk to young people today, and we've been engaged for the past couple of years, I suppose, and still are, in all of these sort of 40th anniversary celebrations, the 40th anniversary a year or so ago of the Summer of Love, and this year the 40th anniversary of Woodstock and the 40th anniversary of the Vietnam War, various aspects of the Vietnam War. What do young people today understand about that time?
Well, I think they're learning from it. The fact that it's a year with a zero at the end makes a difference. And so there are at least 3 books that I know of that are coming out about Woodstock. And it's called the 40th anniversary of the Manson murders. Mm-hmm. And people don't understand that. They think, oh, he was a hippie, when he was never a hippie. He was spent most of his life in prison. And his family were thieves and murderers and rapists. And so I think that a byproduct of these anniversary celebrations is bringing young people up to date about what really happened at that time, and not the quick imagery of, if they think of the hippies in the 60s, all they think of is 2 main images, a party where people are passing a joint around, or police throwing a bunch of hippies into a wagon that's going to take them to the local jail, and it was much deeper than that. You know, it was true. It was sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Underneath that was this spiritual revolution where people really wanted to deprogram themselves from the mainstream culture, which they considered had inhumane attributes, and then reprogram themselves in a more humane philosophy, and then live up to that, live that philosophy, not just have it as an abstract belief. And so I think that more people are open now to change. With factors such as the environment, such as the recession, is sort of forcing them into alternative ways of thinking and being.
It just makes it tougher when so many escape into the celebrity entertainment culture of the day.
Oh yeah, there are people. You know, I just saw the movie Bruno, where this guy wants to be famous. You know, it's not that he's talented; he just wants to be famous. And there is so much of that now. It's kind of heartbreaking to see how many thousands and thousands of people line up in order to audition for American Idol. Not that they have talent, but they want fame.
Was there that desire for fame in the 60s, do you think?
I guess there's always been, you know, people are called born leaders in whatever the fields are, entertainment or politics. So I think that that's just the human condition is to want to be admired and recognized and acknowledged by others. But it depends, because fame is a tool. You know, it's if you want to reach more people, then fame helps. And so artists, whether writers or photographers or movie makers or painters or sculptors, poets, whatever they are, a lot of them are willing to just communicate with their hard drives. And others really want to be discovered by more and more, and you know, there's a satisfaction. I'm glad that whatever public recognition I have is of my name rather than my appearance, so that I can still be an observer rather than the observed. And you know, I can go out in public. I don't have to do what Elvis Presley did, which was go to the dentist at midnight, where there would be nobody in the waiting room. And so it could be a terrible burden, you know, and an addiction, as it was in Michael Jackson's case.
And what are you doing online now? Tell us about are you blogging, what are you doing?
I blog occasionally for Huffington Post and Counterpoint and Reality Sandwich, and I do I use my computer for three purposes: as a word processor. I do. It has destroyed the concept of a first draft, because now you edit as you go along.
Right.
But it's also changed the nature of, you know, there used to be books, collections, anthologies of great letter writers. And now, you know, you cannot, people, what is it going to be in the future? The great Twitters of our time. You know, collections of 140 characters by 140 characters. It used to be people would flourish words, and now they'll just say, that's cool, will be an email instead of a long analysis. And it leads to a certain carelessness that, whereas people would proofread their stuff previously, now there's a kind of carelessness. Oh, that's good enough, and you can see the typos are blatant in email. So I use for word processing, email, and research. I'm more of a less of a Luddite. I never even learned how to drive a car, but I'm becoming almost as much in awe of technology as I am in awe of nature.
Paul Krassner, thank you so much for spending time with us today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.